Barnes & Noble Union Square, please give a warm welcome to New York Times bestselling author and National Book Award-winning Percival Everett, Academy Award-winning, Emmy Award-winning writer and director Cord Jefferson, and host of Poured Over BNN's Miwa Messer.
Hello, New York. So, I don't often get to tape a second time in a single year with a writer, and Percival and I launched James with a taping at the Grove in March. And I think the dude's been home for like 3 days out of the last 8 months. And we were talking about doing this event, and then Cord said, "Hey, I'm in New York. Can I join you?" And we said, "Yeah." So, some of you might know the origin story of American fiction, which is one of my favorite films of the last decade. And I want to start there. I promise you we will get to James. I promise. But I want to start with American fiction because these guys run on parallel tracks. And I want you to know this backstory because it's kind of amazing and it's kind of magical and it doesn't happen that often. So, Cord, I want to start with you. You were reading American fiction. You found this book. Erasure, sorry.
No, it's fine.
I should know better, man. I should know, because I actually read Erasure when it first came out. But you were looking at a review for Interior Chinatown, the Charlie Yu novel, which won the National Book Award a couple years ago. And you see this book mentioned.
Mm-hmm. It said Interior Chinatown had a satire reminiscent of Percival Everett's Erasure. And I'd never read Erasure before, and so a couple days, I was looking for, it was probably right around this time, 4 years ago. Mm-hmm. So November, December of 2020, and I was in a bookstore and saw Erasure and decided to pick it up. I was looking for a new novel to read over the holidays, and I'm a pretty slow reader, and I read that book in about a week, which is fast for me, and it just, every time that I touched it, it felt like it was like electrified. Mm-hmm. That's how it felt when it was in my hands. And so I rushed to my manager and said, "I think I found something that I want to try to adapt into a film." And I called Percival in January of 2021, and we went from there.
Okay, so Percival, 30-minute phone conversation, right? Is that how the legend goes? 30-minute phone conversation with Cord, and you said, "Yeah."
No, I hung up on him the first time.
Oh, okay.
No, we talked. I liked Cord quite a bit. He had no money, and that was.
That is true.
So I almost hung up on him, but I liked him, and he's a con artist. I trusted him.
Well, he works in film.
Yeah.
With all respect, my friend, you work in film.
But to his credit, it's true. I had no money, and Percival very kindly, because I had no money and I was just going to write the script on spec. Spec means I wasn't writing it for anybody. I was just going to write it and see if people liked it. He gave me the rights for free for 6 months, and he said, "Go write a script, and if something comes of it and you sell it, then you can pay me then." And it changed my life. Like his willingness to do that changed my life.
I have to say, it's also part of what made me want to see the film, because you don't often get that level of buy-in from the guy who kicks it off.
Yeah.
And also, Percival's books have not really been, shall we say, adapted a lot.
No.
So I was really curious. And then I see Jeffrey Wright attached to it. And then I see the film. And you move it from DC to Massachusetts, and hi, Bostonian living in exile by choice, just to be clear. And I left the movie thinking, how did he know my people? Mm-hmm. Because I knew the book, and I recognized the characters, but then there's this spin on it, because you have to change for the medium, right? I mean, yes, it's a very talky film, but you have to change for the medium. How did you get from your interpretation of Erasure to what we ultimately see on the screen? I mean, part of it is Jeffrey Wright, part of it is the cast, right?
Yeah. I think that, to me, the key to adaptation isn't necessarily, I think, maintaining I'll tell you, the first adaptation that I ever worked on was Watchmen for HBO. I wrote on the HBO series Watchmen, and the thing that Damon Lindelof, who created that show, would say all the time was he would say we need to we need parameters. We sort of can come up with what we want for the world, but we need to maintain some parameters so we're not just sort of shooting, that we need a bullseye to aim for. And he would say, all I care about is that it feels like the original Watchmen, that it sort of feels that the idea could have existed in the original text. And so that was sort of, it's kind of like the Supreme Court definition of pornography, when you see it, right? But it did give us sort of a window to aim for. And I think that lesson carried over when I was trying to adapt Erasure, and the idea that I needed to allow myself to envision something new, because it's not going to be the same thing. It shouldn't be the same thing, while also sort of maintaining what I think really spoke to me about the original text.
Right.
And to me, that was, it couldn't be self-serious. It needed to be funny. It couldn't be didactic. It couldn't sort of try to tell people, here's the good things and the bad things. Here's the lessons you needed to learn. There was these kinds of tent poles that I felt really needed to exist in order to make it maintain the spirit of the book that I loved while also becoming something new.
So, Percival, you obviously saw American Fiction before the rest of us.
Yes.
Okay.
That was the most terrible. Percival and Danzy, his wife, came over to my house and watched it on my couch. And it was the most terrifying screening. The movie wasn't done yet, and I'm pretty sure you know how when you're showing somebody a movie that you love and they haven't seen it before, and you spend the whole time just watching them to see what they think. That's what I was doing. It was just I was just staring at Percival and Danzy like that.
And that's really unnerving too.
But Percival, for you, I mean, you're looking at something that you know the origin of, that is an adaptation of work that technically came out in 23, right? So,
yeah.
And Erasure had published in 2001.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I'm not proprietary about my work, and it's exciting that anybody will take something and turn it into another work of art. And when I saw the film, I loved it because it was not my novel.
Yeah.
It was Cord's movie, and that was thrilling. But it's a translation, and this is one of the things I appreciate about translation is when my French translator writes Erasure, obviously it's going to be different.
Right.
A translator is making a completely new book based on another book. It's a great thing in art, and that's what Cord was doing. He was he was translating my novel into film. It's his film, and that's exciting. And fortunately, I liked it. But even if I hadn't, it still would be a great experience to see another work of art generated. It pisses me off that it was so good.
But that translation, that spirit of that translation brings us to James. I mean, Huck Finn. Cord, when was the last time you read Huck Finn?
When I was a kid.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I read James twice. Once cold, and once after forcing my way through a Norton annotated Huck Finn. And I would like a pony, please. Did it. I love James, though. I love the character of James. I love the way the story flows. I love the idea that there are two entirely different means of speech. Like, James lives in translation as well. And retelling is not a word you like, Percival, that you've always said that James is in conversation with Twain.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to inhabit that world, but try to owe no loyalty to that text. And unfortunately, I did a very painful exercise to divorce myself from that text. I read Huck Finn 15 times in a row. I would end and then go right back to the beginning. The first thing I learned was that I really only needed to do it 10 times. After 4 times, I was pretty sick of it. But that's what I wanted. I wanted it to be a blur, so that so when I appealed to that world, it would be an act of memory.
Yeah.
Not about words, but about something that happened. And so some things that happened in the novel show up because I was remembering them. But I never looked, after the 15th time, I never looked at that text again. So I never appealed to the novel to understand what was going on.
Right.
Yeah.
But I don't think... How many of you in the audience have already read James? Okay. I will still stay away from spoilers, but I think there are going to be some of you who understand sort of obliquely a little bit of what... I mean, there's a moment that calls back to Invisible Man, for instance. There are other moments that do pull from the original Twain text, but then you also move the timeline up, and we are much closer to the Civil War than Twain would have been. I mean, you've always talked about Huck Finn as sort of being a portrait of American adolescence, like the country itself.
Yes.
And I would argue that Huck Finn is a Western, a little bit.
Well, I guess in a way it was a picaresque, and it is sort of
Okay.
a frontier novel.
And Cord is working on something that's a Western. And I want to sort of look at this idea of America, right? And we have sort of the mythology of the opening of America. We have the mythology of homesteading, all of this stuff. And black and brown people get left out of that quite a lot. So the idea of reclaiming the opening of the American West, right? Westerns, cowboy narratives, all of this kind of stuff. I really want to play with that for a second with the two of you, especially with the one who keeps calling himself a cowboy. Professor at USC, cowboy. But I think it runs through James in a way, and it also, I'm really curious about what Cord's working on now. I don't know how much you can actually talk about what you're working on, but this idea of a Western in Tucson centered on black people, I think is important.
Yeah, I mean, I'm from Arizona, and so I once I started making movies, I thought the American Southwest is so cinematic and so beautiful. Why not try to set something there? And so it's not a Western in sort of the tradition. You know, it's contemporary. It's set in present day. So I would say it's inspired by this movie that I really love called Hell or High Water. Yeah. Of these two brothers who are bank robbers, kind of like a modern Western, but it's two black men who are sort of traveling throughout the American Southwest looking for their missing third brother. They track him down to this small town in Arizona. But Percival teaches a class on Westerns, which is not something that I knew. He teaches a class on Western films at USC, and so I remember asking Percival before I set out on this project to define what is actually what sort of the tenets of a Western. And he said something that you sort of were alluding to, which is that he said that, a Western really is about the American myth. It's sort of like about what America thinks of itself and how it imagines itself. And that to me was an exciting foundation on which to try to build this endeavor.
Ironically, I never liked Westerns growing up. And then I wrote a novel, God's Country, but to write it, I wanted it to have a language of the Western that didn't exist. So I had to internalize that mythology. So I read about 150 pulp Westerns, and you can see that I'm a masochist, and watched probably as many films. And I ended up writing this parody of the Western form. In doing so, I tricked a lot of people into thinking I knew something about Westerns. And in fact, there's a kind of a funny story about this. I was invited to a cowboy symposium in Cody, Wyoming, at the Buffalo Bill Historical Center. And I said, well, and they said, would you like to come? I said, well, yes, yeah, I'd love to. And a woman from one of the television networks, this was in 2003 or something, I don't remember. Oh, actually, no, it was in 1993 or 4. And she called me and said that she was going to be at the symposium and would love to talk to me about black cowboys. And I said, well, that would be great, but I don't know anything about black cowboys. And you should really talk to, and I named a historian, a friend of mine named Todd Gunther, who lives in Wyoming and has done a lot of research on the subject. And she said, oh, really? And I said, yeah, you talk to Todd. And so we hung up, and she called me back and said, we really would rather talk to you. And then I kind of saw which way the wind was blowing. It's television, and they didn't, and Todd's white, and I said, well, and I started to get kind of cranky, and she said, no, we'd like to talk to you. And I said, well, if you read these books, I named a couple of books, maybe I can talk to you. There were books about black cowboys, and she said to me, a writer, oh, I don't do paper. And this is back before cell phones, and that, that satisfying clunk when you hang up on someone, I still remember how good that felt.
Amazing. He's told me that his favorite joke that he's written is in God's Country, and I think it's a great joke.
Oh, yeah, there's a line, I have to set up a little bit. This white rancher sees his farm being attacked by white men masquerading as Indians, and they ride off with his wife. And then he tries to hire a black tracker to help him find his wife. And the tracker wants nothing to do with this man. And he says, Jesus Christ, man, it's 1872. Ain't you ever going to forget about this slavery stuff?
Oh, God. He's my favorite. My favorite dude.
Yeah.
But you don't think of James as a comic novel, and all of the reviewers kept saying, well, this is the funniest thing I've ever read in my life. I mean, and I remember you saying this to me, and I was like, I do remember finding stuff funny, but sort of in a raised eyebrow, I hope other people get this joke way. But you really don't think of this book as a comic novel.
I don't think anything I write is comic. I mean, I'm ironic, pathologically ironic, and I think irony can sometimes be funny, but I'm never trying to write comedy. But apparently, sometimes I can be funny.
I think the thing that one of the reasons why Erasure and so much of Percival's work speaks to me, and the thing that I think that maybe those people are missing, right, is that I think that the strange thing that I think people are like, but this is a book about slavery.
Right.
Why is there jokes in it?
Right.
Why am I laughing? Because we have been conditioned by a culture that is afraid to come off as glib when we're talking about serious subjects.
Yeah.
We've been conditioned to think, well, if I'm watching something about slavery, it needs to be miserable. It need to be miserable the whole time. These people need to be sad, right? There can't be humor here. And I think that the thing that Percival's work that does, I think, is so beautifully is acknowledges, if we sort of write books about slavery and we make movies about slavery, and we don't acknowledge that these people were resilient and falling in love and telling jokes and making music and like finding ways to find the joy in life, that to me does a disservice to the people who actually lived those things, because it suggests that they were not resilient people, and we know that they were resilient people. That's why we're here, right? Is because the people who came before us were resilient. And so I think that we've been conditioned strangely by culture to think that like, well, this isn't supposed to be funny. And so if it's funny at all, then it's a comedy. And it's like, no, it's just acknowledging what life was like for people, which is that like, you know, some days are terrible, and even in the terrible times, you still find ways to laugh, and you still find ways to be a human being.
It's the humanity that we connect to. If you strip the humanity out, then you're given a textbook.
Yeah.
Right? And everything becomes theoretical. And with James, and I'm really, the second chapter where James is teaching the children how to speak outwardly. And regardless of whether or not you've grown up in a multilingual household or anything like that, it's living in translation is something that I think any human being can relate to, right? There's the public face and the private face. There's the how do I get through this meeting with a neutral expression? I'm not the only person who's had to do that. All of these things, right? Like that, to me, is the soul and the swing of James. And it was not necessarily Percival's making a face.
No. This is my face.
But bringing that humanity back. I mean, if you think of Monk Ellison for a second, I mean, he's a little bit of a prig. He could have been, you know, not who we experience. But same thing, we get to see his mistakes and his humanity. And the same thing with his brother, called Bill in the book, but Cliff in the film.
I think that that's important. I really, again, like, I think that I really like, I think that another thing that we haven't done very often in culture is allow black characters to be messy and to be complex and layered and nuanced the way that all people are, right? It's like I something that comes to me all the time that I'm reluctant to do every time is like the first black X, the first black race car driver, the first black whiskey distiller, the first black, and like, well, don't you want to do a story about them? And it's like, look, man, I love celebrating excellence. We should celebrate excellence, but I also just want to write stories about black people who are kind of fuck ups, you know, and like, and sometimes do really well, and then sometimes screw up because they're human beings. And I think that one of the things that really attracts me to Percival's writing is that it sort of like allows for flawed and complex and nuanced black characters whose lives are as full as anybody else's life.
You know, I'm just sick of dignity.
Yeah.
You know, what do you say after you've seen a movie about slavery? You walk out and say, well, that really changed my mind. And that was kind of the problem with a lot of things that I would see is, and this is what makes Huck Finn important. We get an enslaved character, albeit he's not fully rendered. The depiction of the character Jim in Huck Finn is woefully lacking, but the character is an enslaved individual, and the novel is not about slavery.
Right.
And that's a different thing.
I tried to read Huck Finn as less of the book that I remembered when I was younger and more of this idea of America as its adolescence. It does make it more palatable in some ways, but I still want to poke holes in this idea of canon, right? And the idea that Huck Finn is canon makes me itch a little bit. And I think I would love to see us as a society and a culture become a little more open to the idea that maybe canon can be reevaluated every couple of decades because it doesn't quite seem to happen.
Well, inherent in the notion of canon is racism and sexism.
Yeah.
It's a bad model. I don't know what one replaces it with. My joke is the canon is loaded, and but it is. It's someone's making decisions about what is going to be are accepted in classic text, and as soon as you embark on that, then you've started in the wrong way.
Right.
But of course, given a nation that is somewhat antagonistic toward education, the last thing they want to do is train teachers who might choose books that they want to teach, but would rather choose the books that they're going to teach, which is in a way another way of banning books. And of course, you know why. who and why people ban books is because reading is really the most subversive thing that we can do. The second most subversive thing is to belong to a book club. And writing is a distant third to all of that.
But let's go back to performance for a second in this concept. Monk is performing his life. James is performing his life, right? There is an expectation of performance for black men and women as we live now, right? Like there is always sort of a, what's the face you're presenting kind of thing. And it's a very Asian concept, face, right? Like there's the internal, there's the external, there's the very placid, the feet are moving like little ducks under the water, but there is, for James and Monk, there is safety in performance in some ways. They can pretend.
Well, safe passage through the culture is
Right.
not something that people of color are the only ones who experience. Fanon writes about the mini mask, and
Right.
W.B. Du Bois talks about double consciousness, and this whole thing about code switching. That's just a new term for something we've understood for a very long time.
Right.
In fact, in some ways, the idea of code switching I find to be misguided, because it's not a practice as much as it is simply living.
Cord, you came up in a relatively mixed community in Tucson, yeah? No?
Tucson, mixed and Tucson do not go well together.
I'm from Boston, so I know nothing.
Tucson has diversity in that there's a lot of Latinos.
Okay.
But outside of Latinos, there's not really.
Okay.
It's white people and Latinos. And where I grew up in a suburb called Oro Valley in the northwest of Tucson, and that was even less diverse. That had even fewer Latinos and was more white and affluent. So there was not a great amount of diversity in my childhood. The black people in town, I was mostly related to all of them, and so it was. There was. I never felt like my childhood was necessarily lacking because of that, because my parents made it. My parents did their best to make it not feel like we were so secluded. So I can probably guarantee I was the only 7-year-old in the theater to see Do the Right Thing the weekend it came out in Tucson. And so they were sort of, and my dad got me I'll never forget this. My dad came home one time with a T-shirt of, it's that photo of Malcolm X holding the rifle, peeking out the window, and it said, "By any means necessary." And he got it for me, and I was like 9. I was like, "What?" It's like, "Where do you expect me to wear this, man? You're gonna wear this to school? People will put on a watch list. We're gonna get run out of town." But they did their best to, expose me to as much black culture as possible.
Right.
But there wasn't a ton of. I wouldn't say that there was a lot of diversity necessarily in Tucson. But so I think that, but I did grow up, if your question is about performance, I do think that, that is, I had to. I learned to feel very comfortable. I learned how to be comfortable walking into a room of only white people. That was sort of something that I had to train myself to do. It was like, because there was a lot of rooms that I would walk into and it would just be all white people. And so that is certainly something that became kind of second nature to me. Is sort of and I think that is, if I'm being honest, I think that is, it became, I guess, even before the term code switching, it was just like, well, I'm just learning how to interact with these kids who have to be my friends, because this is basically my entire school.
Yeah, no, it is just life.
Yeah.
It is. It's just adaptation, and it's moving as quickly as you can through whatever situation it might be. But watching Monk and watching James do this, and there are a couple of moments in James, obviously, where the stakes are extremely high, and I feel like there's a through line directly from James to Monk Ellison. Here's James saying, I wrote with a pencil, I wrote myself into being. Monk cannot separate himself from the work that he does. He is his work. And in fact, that's how we end up with My Pathology, right?
Yeah. I was never thinking that way, but now that you've scared me now. But it's, one of the things that's so strange is Cord was talking about his upbringing. There's an expectation of Black Americans that they have an experience. And there is no singular Black American experience.
Right.
If you live in Wyoming and you're Black, and there are 8 Black people in Wyoming, their experience with America is different. Why should someone in Seattle who is Black be like someone in Florida who is Black? They're not. And then the religion, socioeconomic status, but there is one thing that we all share, and the metaphor for this is the blue light in your rearview mirror. No matter where you are in the United States of America and you're Black, when you see the blue light in your rearview mirror, you're terrified. White people think, oh, maybe I'll get a ticket. I think, well, maybe I'll get shot. That's the one experience that seems to be universal for us. And it's not just Black people, it's people of color. My Native friends feel the same way. That's the one thing that runs through it. And maybe the one thing that runs through from James to Monk.
But language, right? We've been talking circles around language throughout this conversation, right? But I want to throw out something that Percival said before, which I had somehow only found when I was noodling over the transcript from our original conversation. But the idea that words have any meaning in and of themselves is a myth. Everything is context, and that's what I'm really writing about.
Propositional content does not exist. Words don't exist in a vacuum. And there's so many things that go into an utterance doing something in the world. If my wife walks in with a new haircut, it's hugely different if I say as soon as she walks in, gee, I like your new haircut, than if I wait 4 hours and say, gee, I like your new haircut. Those are different things. It's inflection, timing, everything. Language means nothing without the situation.
Which is how storytelling carries across medium.
Of course,
Media,
yeah.
excuse me.
Yeah.
I mean, Cord, you've talked about this quite a lot in past interviews too, where you've just said, I do think you can develop the muscles for telling stories, and you can apply it, whether it's, you've been writing short stories recently, and I'm waiting for that collection. I'm just putting it on the record that I am waiting for this collection. But the idea that you can write for the screen, and writing for film and writing for television are actually separate as well. So, I mean, can we just talk about process for a second, and the idea that if you are not doing the thing for the sake of the thing, then why are you doing it?
Yeah, I mean, Percival has become a hero of mine for many reasons, but he's also become. But one of the reasons is because that I've never met another artist who just does the work for the work's sake, and sort of I came over to Percival's house for dinner one night, and he asked me to come a little early, and I came a little early, and he gave me a painting that he had done for me.
Right.
And he makes music, and this is a person who just creates to create because he finds joy in the making of things. And I think that for me, when I graduated from college, I worked at a clothing store for the first 6 months out of school, and then I got this job as a communications coordinator at this very small nonprofit for about a year after that, and I would just come home every night and write, just because that's what kept me sane. I hated my jobs. I hated the people that I worked with, to be honest. But I found sort of some relief in the writing that I did every night, and it wasn't for anybody. I wasn't sending it out. I was just doing it because it felt special to me. And now I talk to young writers all the time, and who say, what do I do to become a writer? And I always say, the number one thing that you should think about if you're interested in getting in any creative career, actually, I say stop and think for a second, like, what success looks like to you. Imagine your sort of like perfect moment of success, whether that's winning some award, whether that's selling some certain number of copies of your book, whether that's making some certain amount of money. Imagine that. Get in your head. And then I say the next thing you should imagine is imagine that never happens.
Right.
If you never achieve that, do you still want to do the thing? Mm-hmm. And if you don't still want to do the thing, then you shouldn't start in the first place. Like you should never begin it, because that is going to be a lifelong. You're going to be miserable. You're going to sort of like, you need to find the joy and the value in the making of the thing. You need to sort of, the reason I started writing is because it was the only thing that made me happy at the end of like my terrible days at these jobs that I hated. And so I think that if you don't have that, then there's really sort of not, the pursuit is going to be more of a torture session for you, sort of like than anything.
I mean, James is your 34th book.
Yeah, well, the definition of insanity is thinking that you can write and make money.
I mean, it took a minute, but you did it anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a collection of sonnets that you wrote.
Wow.
Yeah, well, it's because I needed to pay some bills.
And sonnets paid.
There's a lot of money in sonnets.
Okay. The bookseller is raising an eyebrow down in the corner here.
Well, to show you how firmly my fingers are pressed against American popular culture's pulse, I wrote a parody of literary theory.
Yes.
Yes. So,
you did.
So
I've read it.
I know the culture.
Let's talk about family for a second. And the way you write about family, and the way Monk experiences family, and the way James experiences family, because there's a vulnerability there that not all men are necessarily going to experience on the page or on the screen. I mean, the way both of you approach masculinity, there's a vulnerability to the masculinity for these characters that we don't always get. I mean, it's something that Hanif Abdur-Rakib does in the new book. There's Always This Year, the basketball book, but it's rare.
I guess I'm just trying to be true to the male influences in my life. My grandfather and my father. My grandfather, give you an idea of what he was like. He had stopped practicing medicine, and one day police came to our house because my grandfather, this was in the early 60s, if you had been shot by the police, he would treat you without reporting it. And he got into trouble doing this. That's what he was like. But he was a very sweet man. My father was the kindest man I've ever met. My father would fold laundry, and he was a dentist. He would vacuum, and he shared the chores with in our house. We all did. At the same time, there was one evening we were driving home, my dad and I, from my mother's family's farm, and we came across a burning cross at night in a pasture. I was 9, and my father was the gentlest person I've ever met. And as we approached this checkpoint, you might call it, where these Klansmen were standing there dressed in their white outfits, I looked at my father, and in his lap was a pistol that I didn't know was in the car, that I had never seen before in my life. And when we got to the checkpoint, he stepped on the gas, and we sped away, and luckily no one followed us. But here was the gentlest person I'd ever known, and still in life, the gentlest one. But the circumstances of the world had him change in a flash to someone who was wielding a pistol. That affected me greatly, even in ways that I couldn't articulate then. And that's who I aspire to be. Not a pistol wielding person, but someone who accepts the world in which he lives, and is open to everyone.
And when I read Erasure, one of the things that really stuck. So, my father is much different from Percival's father. It sounds like. he is a very sweet, kind, lovely man. But my father is a Vietnam veteran who came back with severe PTSD from the war, and you know, was a 24-year-old, and back when they didn't even have vocabulary for PTSD.
Right.
And so he's just been white knuckling it his whole life, and sort of, basically what I'm trying to say is the way that I learned to be a man was Stoicism.
Right.
Was you didn't show emotion, you didn't talk about it, you sort of like kept a stiff upper lip, and you didn't complain about your life, you didn't complain about your problems. And so that's how I learned to be a man. I learned that sort of like you just deal with it, you don't talk to anybody about anything, you just go on with your life. And so I, for a very, very long time, struggled with a lot of deep anger. And I still have a lot of deep anger. I've just learned to channel it in better ways. But to me, that was sort of some of the sort of themes that I was trying to touch on in the film, particularly with Cliff and Monk's stories, were that these, you know, I think so much of what the film is about is what happens when you don't give people the freedom to be who they want to be.
Right.
You know, and sort of the strange things that people will start doing when they don't feel free to be themselves, and the strange behaviors that they start taking on, and the strange ways they start acting. That to me was a huge, and one of the reasons that was a huge theme in the film is because that's been a huge theme in my life.
Right.
It's because I, for a very long time, didn't feel free to, you know, I spoke to this therapist, gave me this really amazing way to look at the world one time. And she said, I was telling her about my anger, and I was, you know, upset about something. And she said, the thing to remember about anger, especially if you're a man, especially if you're a black man, is that if you look underneath anger, always you will find either pain or fear.
Right.
And our society is sort of conditions young black men in a way that says you're not supposed to say that you're afraid. You're not supposed to say that you hurt my feelings. Those are things that sort of you keep inside. Those are things, not things that men say. And you just sort of like move on. And so it was this really interesting, it was okay for me to like yell and scream and get in fights, because that felt like that's what a man does. You know, a man loses his temper. But really sort of what I was doing was just lashing out because I was in a lot of pain. And I think that because that's what I learned from the men in my family. And so to me, that's why I wanted to approach those themes in the film, was because I think that I've since worked on those issues, and it has opened my life up in such a valuable way. And it's you know, I feel like I'm almost a completely different person, almost on a molecular level since I started working on that stuff. But I do think that it's something that, not even just black men, but I don't think I need to tell anybody in here that we've got a men problem in sort of like America these days. And I think that masculinity is just a prison, you know, it's a prison. And I think that we've got a lot of people who are stuck in the prison right now and not able to figure it out. But I think that it's especially tumultuous for black men too, and people of color, because I think that the expectation is like, life is hard. And you need to, you know, that was the way that I was raised. My dad said, being black is hard. You need to do 2 for every white person's 1 if you want to get ahead. And that's the way it is. So deal with it. Don't complain about it. Life's not fair. That was probably the resounding thing over and over. That was the thing that I heard most in my life when I was a kid, was life's not fair.
There's something you said that I want to go a little further with, because that's part of the fun, right? Like, I remember watching you come up from Gawker.
Yeah.
I mean, snarky kid.
Yeah.
And it's still, there was something there. And
Gawker was just a really beautiful ball of rage.
Yeah.
It was. It was just
I
the
kept
most,
it open on my desktop. Are you kidding me?
Yeah, it was
I
like
just
a really.
What are they doing now?
It's the closest I'll ever come to like working on a pirate ship, like with like actual scary pirates.
I can see it, but still, I mean, there was enough for me to run around New York asking if he had a literary agent. I was like, is this kid working on a memoir? Is this kid from Tucson doing a thing yet? Oh, man, I drove people around the bend. They were like, no, you already asked me. I'm like, I know. Well, that was like a month ago.
I have an agent now.
Okay.
I do.
How are the short stories going?
I'm working on 2 other ones right now. They're going well. I mean, I just don't have the time. That's the problem. Is the hardest part is finding the time to write, and it's also, you know, deciding which is, because sometimes I have an idea that I think might be good for like a book, but then I'm like, why not just write a movie. It's sort of deciding which avenue is best for each project. And
Stories are fun.
stories are really fun, but
Short stories,
everybody tells me
mean-
that everybody's like, "But short stories don't sell. Don't write short stories. Nobody buys short stories."
Weren't you the guy who was just saying, do the art for the art's sake?
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, if I write a book of short stories and then it doesn't sell, what did I just self-publish it? You know?
No, you're not going to self-publish that. No. No, many of us have ideas already. You're not going to self-publish.
I'm just saying.
You
though,
can just chip away at them in the corner, Cord. Just chip away. And then suddenly you have like 12 stories. And we could do it with 8.
Okay, let's do it. Let's talk about it. I'm happy to. Do they need a unifying theme?
No.
I love I'm actually surprised. I'll say this in the book. I'm actually surprised that short stories aren't more popular, because the thing that I love about them is I love that you can just sort of like read one on the subway and then you're done.
Yeah.
And you sort of like go to work. And I think that our attention spans are pulled in so many directions these days. To me, the short story makes perfect sense, because it's like you knock one out and then you move on. It's strange to me that novels outsell short stories at such a high clip.
I'm not a story person. I have a few books of short stories, but it's usually because they're distractions when I'm working on something longer. And I think novelistically, I think that's why people like shows, television, series, is because when you become involved in a novel, you become involved in a world. And I mean, would people watch one 45-minute television show?
You mean one episode?
Yeah, and if there were no other ones to follow it. And I don't know if they would.
A short film.
A short film.
Yeah.
And short films aren't very popular.
Yeah.
So I think there's the idea of being invested in a world. But some stories can do that. But when I start thinking about writing something, if I really become invested, I don't think about writing stories because and it's not a disparaging thing I'm not saying anything disparaging about stories. It's not something I do. It's not something I think about.
Right.
And there are different forms. A story is not a short novel, and a novel is not just a long story. And there's some writers who write fantastic stories and have never written novels. Amy Hempel, for example, she writes fantastic stories. I could never do what she does. I don't put as much work into stories as I do into novels. They're just different things.
I'm going to bring us back to the question I wanted to ask a second ago, which is, does art bring us our moral center?
Well, that's above my pay grade. I don't know if that's true. Art's important, and we're going to make it. I was driving up from Wyoming up into Pine Ridge in South Dakota, and I had to go through Nebraska. And right outside of Alliance, Nebraska, on the, I don't remember which highway, but on the east side of the highway, I looked over and there were these cars, half buried in the ground, and they were all painted gray. And it was Carhenge. Someone had made a replica of Stonehenge with cars. And now you can probably see it on the internet. I don't go into the internet because it's a bad neighborhood, but there it was, and someone didn't get paid to make Carhenge.
Right.
Some farmer with a tractor and some derelict cars made this, and I will never forget it. Someone had to make this work of art, this sculpture, for no reason except he felt it, or she felt it. I don't know who made it. And it says something to everyone who sees it.
Right.
What it says, I don't know. So moral center, maybe. I don't. Nebraska's not doing all that hot, but for someone, yes.
I think to me, the sort of if you derive, if sort of we understand morality to be like the golden rule, right? Treat others as you'd like to be treated, because sort of everybody suffers the same. Then I would say that I think what art allows us to do is I think the novel is the closest you can come to being in somebody else's brain. I think that sort of out of all the art forms, I think it's there's one that really puts you inside. Really, if you want to live in somebody else's head for a while, read a novel. And to me, I do think, I think an example is the first time I was born in 1982, and the first time I can remember ever watching or experiencing a piece of art, if you want to call it art, with a trans person in it, was Ace Ventura,
Right.
Pet Detective. And there was a trans character in there, and at the end of and it was, this was a massive blockbuster comedy that year,
Right.
and there's a trans person in it, and when somebody finds out, Ace Ventura finds out that he's kissed this trans woman, and the joke is that he starts like vomiting, and he's so disgusted, and everybody's so disgusted. And it's this big sort of, it's this big hilarious moment at the end of the film, and that was a Jim Carrey movie. It was a Jim Carrey blockbuster, like a summer hit, and that was the first person that's the first time that I'd ever seen a trans person in a movie, and I was a kid. I left thinking like, oh, this is, she was a sexual predator, sort of deceiving everybody, right? And then probably 6 years later, I was in high school and I saw this movie, Boys Don't Cry.
Right.
This is like the second time I saw a trans person in film. And it was a completely different experience. And I felt like I actually was understanding this person, a kind of person that I had never met before. I'd never met a trans person before in my life. And all of a sudden, I was like, oh, I got it. It felt like you're actually traveling in somebody else's shoes. It felt like you're living in somebody else's story for a while. And to me, that to me is what art does. I read a crazy statistic. I went back and looked. Sometimes you're like, I must be misremembering this because it can't be that crazy. And I went back and looked, and it was that crazy. I read this article in the Washington Post in 2014 about this study that said 76% of white Americans had not a single friend of color. Not a friend who was black. Like 76% of white Americans had no friends who were not white. And if you think about it, like, America was designed this way, right? Redlining and segregation, like we built it. This is a foundational sort of part of this country, was to sort of like keep people separated. And so, to me, that's by design. And to me, one of the main problems is that we just don't know each other. We just don't know each other enough. And to me, what art has always been is, it's been a gateway to understanding that just everybody's the same. Yeah. Everybody's the same. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. It doesn't matter what country you're from. It doesn't matter what language you speak, what God you believe in. When you really get down into it, we're all the same. And I think that to me is what art has done. And so I think that if morality is just like we're all the same and we should be nice to each other, then I think that art has given me that understanding. It's allowed me to meet all these different kinds of people that I've never met before. And understand really at bottom, we're all the same. And I think that is always, that to me is what the best art can provide. The fact that you said that you were able to watch American fiction and be like, that's my family. Like, oh my God, I empathize with that family.
Super not kidding. Like, really my family.
The fact that I was able to read Erasure and be like, that's my family. I'm not from DC, but like, I recognize all of these people. I think that to me is the beauty of this work and why art is important.
Well, there's a certain power to it. You were mentioning Westerns.
Yeah.
And this is something I've been seeing lately. Sort of the converse of what Cord is saying. I don't even remember the titles of the films I watched. I watched a couple of movies. There's this whole genre of Navy SEAL movies, or that kind of thing, and I started counting, because Americans like to tally things, and the enemy, one bullet kills them. Many of them and the 3 Americans get shot 57 times, and they're still running and jumping, and that's kind of what Westerns are all about. But it's this thing about masculinity is how do we want to see ourselves, and that's a really scary thing to me.
Right.
Is that the horde comes running over, and you blow them all away, and we don't care. One of us gets shot, and we cry over the body. Mm-hmm. Someplace in our making art, that has to be pulled back, and the enemy has to become real to us. Mm-hmm. And that's what I miss, and that's the opportunity we have in making stories, is to give humanity to everyone.
Right. And that seems like a really good place to wrap. So I'm going to say thank you, Cord Jefferson. Thank you, Percival Everett. Thank you, audience. I'm Miwa Messer, and this is Poured Over. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.